for people that don't know the history of the passenger pigeon, it was the most abundant bird in North America, possibly the most abundant bird to ever have lived in the world in all of history that we know of. The populations in the 1800s, early 1800s, are estimated anywhere between 3 and 5 billion, possibly twice as much as that. It's hard to put a number on it because, even today, nobody can count 1 billion animals in the wild. And not only was there that many, there's nearly 8 billion people, but we're spread out across the entire globe. 5 billion passenger pigeons lived just in the eastern forests of North America. And they flew and they weren't spread out across that forest either. They lived in flocks that were 1 to 2 billion birds strong. So the entire species flew in just 2 or 3 flocks total. These just giant flocks that blotted out the sunlight, took days to pass over one spot, and they were historians have called them a biological tempest. I mean, the impact they had on forests was so incredible. And that's, with telling this story like this, we can really pinpoint a few different reasons why we started with passenger pigeons. One is their cultural value to the United States. They're an icon of Americana in the eastern U.S. A lot of people now, because they've been gone so long, are not really familiar with them. But for decades and centuries, they were a cornerstone of meat markets and recreation. And, they were this immensely, I mean, the best way of putting it is it's you can't miss a flock of 1 billion birds.
Right.
I mean, so they were, and because you can't miss a flock of 1 billion birds, you definitely can't miss when it disappears. That's the second real cultural value to the passenger pigeon, is that at the turn of the century, in the 1900s, the very last passenger pigeon in the wild was shot in 1902. And the giant flocks that had lived in the 1800s were virtually gone by 1885. And people just did not stop persecuting them. They were harvested on an industrial scale. There was the first time that people were using communication technologies to track the movements of a species and go out and harvest it. And because they were these flocks of billions, it was easy to get a lot of birds all at once. There was a guy that had a record shot that he just shot up into the sky, and he killed 132 passenger pigeons with one shot. I mean, people literally harvested millions at a time.
But how many people were in the States at that point? I mean, were people eating a pigeon a day? How did...
They were probably eating more than a pigeon a day. I mean, it was a staple food source in many areas. When the birds came through, it was the thing they would eat every day for so long that they would eventually be like, oh, don't show me another pigeon, I can't eat it. Until the 1860s. Now, when the 1860s rolled around, we had the connection of Chicago and New York by a railway. And that went right through the heart of passenger pigeon country. And we also had the invention of the telegraph. And so those two developments allowed people to basically transport passenger pigeons to major city markets within a matter of a day, a few days. It made it to where they could really provide these passenger pigeons to a larger base of people all year round. And so it really intensified the harvesting. And then the telegraphs people were able then, as I said, to be able to say, oh, we just saw a flock go north by St. Louis. And so the trappers and the people going out getting these birds were able to head off the flocks, basically, and know where they were going and where they were going to be. This was a systematic harvesting in a way that the world had never done before. And in just a matter of 30 years, it brought about the complete collapse of this species. And because it was people's entire livelihoods, because an entire nation was feeding off of this animal, when it disappeared, it was undeniable. Passenger pigeons were not the first species human beings obliterated. We've been causing extinctions for over 100,000 years. And in historic times, the dodo bird was driven to extinction in the 1600s. But for years, all the way up to the 1800s, people didn't believe that extinction happened. Scientists even debated it. It was like, oh, well, the world's big. Just because we don't see mammoths in Europe anymore, it doesn't mean they're not wandering the Great Plains of North America.
So this is the species that really kicked off people thinking about this as a subject, as a possibility.
Well, what it did was, by the time this extinction came around, scientists were, the edges of the map were filling in. Scientists were saying, you know what, yeah, mammoths are extinct. Dinosaurs are extinct. But all those species died out a long time ago. And so they were like, there's no way human beings caused the extinction of those animals because it happened due to natural causes and other things. And that's when it became weird, like this weird area where people were like, yeah, species don't go extinct because of people. They thought species were an inexhaustible resource, and if they went extinct, it was some part of either a greater plan of God or nature. And the passenger pigeon's extinction was the first extinction that was so undeniably caused by human beings that it triggered the modern conservation movement. The modern conservation movement, it had been slowly building up for a couple decades at the time, but it wasn't really gaining traction. And then that extinction made everybody go, whoa. And they started, taking inventory of what we had been doing in the United States. And every species in the eastern United States was on the brink of extinction at the time. I mean, white-tailed deer were nowhere to be found. Squirrels were scarce. Wild turkey were an endangered species. People don't realize that today. And the passenger pigeon's extinction was a catalyst that made people go, we have to stop doing things the way we're doing them. And in the United States, the very first laws to protect the trade of wildlife went into effect in the early 1900s, thanks to the passenger pigeon extinction. And the bison was part of a major recovery program, which was inspired by the pigeon. People used to say, don't let the bison go the way of the pigeon. And by the early 1930s, we had the advent of ecological science and game management, where people no longer just harvested species in an unregulated fashion, but they were doing harvests in a way to actually help species start to rebound. Since the passenger pigeon's extinction in the United States, there has not been a recorded extinction of a species in which the hunting has been regulated. And in fact, the number of extinctions due to overharvest has basically disappeared. The reasons species have been going extinct now for the last century are disease and habitat degradation, habitat loss, reductions in population size from invasive species. It's the cast of threats has kind of shifted. And with that shift in threats, of course, we get back to what I was talking about earlier, that these threats we're facing now, they're not new, but since they're dominant now, these are threats that are just so difficult to handle and work around, where the biotechnologies come in.